Christina Riggs. Christina Marie Riggs was a licensed practical nurse and the biological mother of two young children, Justin Riggs, age 5, and Shelby Riggs, age 2. On the night of November 4th, 1997, inside her apartment in Sherwood, Arkansas, Riggs ended the lives of both of her children while they slept. The victims were entirely dependent on her for care and protection. Riggs later described the acts as an act meant to prevent her children from suffering in the future. Riggs was divorced and raising her two children alone at the time of the crimes. She worked from time to time as a licensed practical nurse, a role that gave her medical knowledge and access to prescription medication. Court records established that she had a long-standing history of major depressive disorder, dating back years before the crime. She had been prescribed antidepressants and had a documented pattern of prescription drug misuse. Family members testified that Riggs loved her children and had no prior history of physical harm toward them. The children were described as healthy and developmentally normal. However, relatives and co-workers noticed significant changes in Riggs' behaviour in the months leading up to the crime. She became increasingly withdrawn, missed work frequently, and expressed feelings of worthlessness and hopelessness. Financial stress added to her emotional instability as she struggled to support her children on limited income. There were no prior police calls, no CPS investigations, and no domestic aggression reports involving the children before the crimes. To those who knew her casually, Christina appeared to be managing single motherhood reasonably well. The decline happening inside her mind remained invisible to most observers. In the weeks before the acts, Riggs's mental state got worse further. She became convinced that her children would be better off dead than growing up without her or facing future hardship. This belief, later identified by experts as altruistic filicide, developed gradually through persistent depressive thinking. Riggs began making concrete preparations. She obtained Elavil, a prescription antidepressant, knowing its sedative effects. She wrote self-harm notes explaining her reasoning and expressing guilt and despair. On the day of the crimes, the children followed their normal bedtime routine, trusting their mother completely. After putting her children to bed, Riggs administered Elavil to sedate them. Once they were unconscious, she smothered each child with a pillow. The acts were quiet and careful and planned. There was no evidence of a struggle, indicating the children were unaware of what was happening. After ending the life of her children, Riggs attempted to take her own life. She injected herself with potassium chloride and ingested additional prescription medication. Her self-harm attempt failed, and she lost consciousness. The sequence of actions demonstrated planning and medical knowledge rather than sudden aggression. Emergency responders arrived after a welfare check was requested. Upon entering the apartment, police discovered the bodies of Justin and Shelby in their beds. Riggs was alive but critically ill and transported to a hospital. When she regained consciousness, Riggs immediately confessed to ending the life of her children. She provided a detailed account of her actions and motives without attempting to shift blame. Autopsies confirmed that the children passed away from lack of oxygen and had sedative drugs in their systems. Riggs was charged with 2 counts of capital homicide. Her defense acknowledged that she committed the acts but argued that her severe depression impaired her judgment. The prosecution countered that Riggs understood the nature and wrongfulness of her actions, pointing to her planning, use of medication, and self-harm notes. The jury found Riggs legally sane and guilty on both counts. Riggs received a capital sentence by lethal injection. The judge emphasized the vulnerability of the victims, the harm of maternal trust, and the deliberate planning involved. The children's grandparents delivered emotional victim impact statements, describing the great loss caused by the loss of both children at once. Riggs accepted the sentence and expressed remorse. She initially pursued appeals but later made the unusual decision to waive all remaining appeals, stating publicly that she deserved punishment for her actions. Christina Riggs' sentence was carried out on May 2, 2000. She became one of the youngest women sentence was carried out in the modern era of the US capital punishment. Her case continues to be cited in scholarly research on maternal filicide, depression-driven aggression, and the ethics of executing mentally ill offenders. Before we move on to the next case, make sure to subscribe if you're finding these stories as disturbing as I am. It helps us keep covering the cases that most channels won't touch. While Christina Riggs at least confessed to her crimes and accepted responsibility, the next mother has spent nearly 3 decades on death row, claiming an intruder ended the life of her children, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Part 2. Darly Routier. Darly Routier is a biological mother who was convicted of causing the loss of life of her 5-year-old son, Damon Routier, inside the family home in Rowlett, Texas, during the early morning hours of June 6, 1996. Routier has always maintained that an unknown intruder entered the home, harmed her children, and fled. Prosecutors argued that the scene was staged and that Routier herself carried out the incident. Darly Routier was married to Darren Routier, and together they had 3 sons: Devon, age 6, Damon, age 5, and Drake, age 7 months. The family lived in a 2-story home in Rowlett, a Dallas suburb. Darren operated a small computer parts business that had experienced financial difficulties in the months leading up to the crime. Court testimony revealed mounting debt, business loans, and financial strain. Friends and acquaintances offered mixed descriptions of Darly's parenting. Some described her as attentive and affectionate, while others characterized her as image-conscious and emotionally unstable. Medical records indicated that Routier had experienced postpartum depression symptoms, though she was not under mental health care at the time of the crimes. On the evening of June 5, 1996, the household followed a routine schedule. Darren went to sleep upstairs with baby Drake, while Darly remained downstairs with Damon and Devon, who were sleeping on the living room floor. There were no reports of arguments or unusual behaviour that night. In the early morning hours, Damon and Devon Routier were cut multiple times with a kitchen knife. Devon sustained 2 fatal cuts with blade wounds to his chest and ended the life of almost immediately. Damon sustained multiple wounds to his back and chest and was pronounced dead at the scene. Darly Routier also suffered a knife wound to her neck, along with bruises and abrasions. Prosecutors argued that Routier inflicted superficial injuries on herself after harming her children. The defence emphasised that her neck wound narrowly missed the carotid artery and could have been fatal. Bloodstain evidence became central to the case, including cast-off patterns and bodily fluid trails inside the home. A sock containing the children's bodily fluid was found in an alley 75 yards from the house. Routier called 911 immediately after the incident. Police arrived within minutes. Initially, investigators considered the possibility of an intruder. As the investigation progressed, focus shifted toward Routier after bloodstain pattern analysis and the absence of clear forced entry. The window screen in the garage had been cut, but investigators believe the cut came from inside rather than outside. No fingerprints belonging to an unknown intruder were found. The investigation relied heavily on forensic interpretation rather than direct eyewitness testimony. Routier was charged with capital homicide for Damon's loss of life. The prosecution's case centered on forensic evidence, alleged financial motive, and the theory that Routier staged the scene. Expert witnesses testified regarding bloodstain patterns, wound severity, and crime scene reconstruction. One particularly controversial piece of evidence was video footage of Routier at her son's gravesite. 8 days after the crimes, on what would have been Devon's birthday, the family held a memorial service. The video showed Darly smiling and spraying silly string on the boys' graves. The prosecution used this to suggest she lacked appropriate grief. The defence argued the video was taken out of context. The jury convicted Routier after deliberating for approximately 6 hours. Following the guilty verdict, Routier received a capital sentence by lethal injection. The judge cited the extreme vulnerability of the child victim and the brutality of the knife incident as serious factors. Darly Routier remains on death row in Texas, with no carrying out the sentence date set. Her case has become a focal point in debates over bloodstain pattern analysis, confirmation bias in legal investigations, and the treatment of mothers accused of filicide. Courts have allowed additional DNA testing on several pieces of evidence, though final outcomes remain waiting. If you're still watching at this point, make sure you're subscribed. We cover cases like this every week, and your support helps us keep going. While Darly Routier's case hinges on disputed forensic evidence, the next mother's guilt is undeniable. She slowly starved her 10-year-old stepdaughter to loss of life, then burned the body in a trash can to hide the evidence. Part 3. Tiffany Moss. Tiffany Moss was convicted of causing the loss of life of her 10-year-old stepdaughter Immani Moss in Gwinnett County, Georgia, after subjecting the child to months of extreme neglect, starvation, and isolation. The crime unfolded inside the family home during 2013 and ended with Immani's loss of life and the subsequent destruction of her body to conceal the crime. Moss was the child's stepmother, but was also a biological mother to other children living in the household. This case represents a prolonged, intentional form of maternal aggression, where a caregiver used starvation and confinement as tools of control, ultimately resulting in a capital sentence. Immani Moss lived in a blended household with her biological father, Immani Moss, her stepmother, Tiffany Moss, and several other children, including Tiffany's 2 biological daughters. The family resided in an apartment in Lawrenceville, a suburb of Atlanta. Prior to the events leading to her loss of life, Immani had been enrolled in public school, where teachers and staff noticed that she appeared severely underweight and malnourished. School officials documented concerns and contacted child welfare authorities due to Immani's physical condition. Teachers reported that Immani seemed hungry all the time, hoarding food when it was available, and that her clothes hung loosely on her shrinking frame. She appeared weak and lethargic in class, struggling to concentrate on schoolwork. Following this help from others, Immani was removed from school and kept inside the home. This decision cut off regular contact with mandated reporters who might have noticed her deteriorating condition and stepped in. According to testimony, Tiffany Moss assumed primary control over Immani's daily life after the school reported their concerns. This included strict control over access to food and movement within the home. Family dynamics were described as strict and controlling, with Moss exerting strict discipline over Immani specifically. Financially, the household struggled, and the family lived modestly in a 2-bedroom apartment. However, financial strain did not explain the different treatment of Immani compared to the other children. There were no documented prior legal charges for Moss related to child harm before Immani's loss of life, but there was clear official awareness that the child was at risk. The fact that authorities had been contacted, but Immani was then removed from school, highlights a tragic failure in the child welfare system. After Immani was withdrawn from school, her isolation grew stronger dramatically. She was confined to a bedroom for extended periods, sometimes locked inside. She was denied adequate food as a form of punishment, though the specific offences that supposedly warranted this treatment were never clearly established. Witness testimony and evidence later showed that this denial occurred over several months, not days or weeks. Moss's behaviour toward Immani became increasingly punitive, while the child's physical condition visibly got worse. By the time of her loss of life, Immani weighed only 32 pounds, less than half of what a healthy 10-year-old girl should weigh. No medical care was sought despite Immani's obvious decline. As the child's body consumed its own muscle and organ tissue for energy, she would have experienced constant hunger, weakness and pain. She would have been cold all the time, as her body lost its ability to regulate temperature. Her hair would have thinned, her skin would have become fragile, and she would have developed sores. The build-up phase was marked not by a single triggering event, but by a pattern of growing neglect and control. Other children in the home were reportedly instructed not to interact with Immani or share food with her. They were told to ignore her pleas for food and were punished if they tried to help her. In the days leading up to her loss of life, Immani was severely weakened and unable to care for herself. She could barely walk and spent most of her time lying down. Her body was shutting down from malnutrition. The last, normal interactions involved Moss maintaining isolation rather than engaging in caregiving behaviour. Immani Moss ultimately passed away from severe malnutrition and dehydration. Medical findings established that her body had been deprived of sufficient calories and fluids for an extended period, leading to organ failure. The medical examiner determined that she passed away from complications of chronic starvation. There was no evidence of a sudden fatal injury. Instead, her loss of life was the result of prolonged suffering over many months. The autopsy revealed that Immani had essentially starved to loss of life, while living in a home where other children were adequately fed. After Immani passed away inside the home, Moss and other adults in the household did not contact emergency services. Instead of calling 911 or seeking help, they decided to conceal what had happened. The child's body was concealed initially, while the adults in the home determined what to do next. Evidence presented at trial showed that Immani's remains were later burned in a trash container outside the apartment complex in an attempt to destroy evidence of the loss of life. The burning of Immani's body was a desperate attempt to hide the crime. Immani Moss and Tiffany Moss carried the child's body out to a garbage bin and set it on fire. Neighbours noticed the fire and the smell, which prompted someone to call 911 to report a suspicious fire in a trash container. There are no eyewitnesses to the moment of loss of life itself, but the pattern of harm and neglect leading up to it was established through circumstantial and forensic evidence. The crime involved a single victim, but occurred in the presence of other children who were exposed to the harm environment. These children witnessed Immani's isolation and decline, but were powerless to intervene or seek help. They had been taught through fear and intimidation not to question what was happening to Immani, or to talk about it with anyone outside the home. Immani's disappearance raised alarms when she failed to return to school and could not be located. School officials, who had been concerned about her from the beginning, reported her missing when the family failed to respond to inquiries about why she was no longer attending school. This prompted a welfare check by law enforcement. During the investigation, inconsistencies emerged in explanations given by adults in the home regarding Immani's whereabouts. Tiffany Moss initially claimed that Immani had gone to stay with relatives, then changed her story to say the child had run away. These shifting stories raised immediate suspicions with investigators. Police searches and forensic analysis eventually led to the recovery of burned human remains from the trash container, which were identified as Immani's through dental records and DNA testing. The condition of the remains made it difficult to perform a complete autopsy, but enough evidence remained to establish prolonged starvation. Investigators documented evidence of prolonged starvation based on bone condition and medical findings. Even after burning, the child's bones showed signs of severe malnutrition and stunted growth. Tiffany Moss did not provide a cooperative account of events and declined to meaningfully assist investigators. The investigation focused on establishing a timeline of neglect rather than a single moment of aggression, which became central to the prosecution's theory. Investigators interviewed teachers, neighbours, and extended family members to document Immani's declining condition over time. Immani Moss, Immani's biological father, eventually cooperated with investigators and agreed to testify against Tiffany in exchange for a plea deal. His testimony would prove crucial in establishing the systematic nature of the harm and Tiffany's role as the primary person who did it. He received a sentence of life without parole. Tiffany Moss was charged with malice homicide and related offences connected to child cruelty and hiding of a loss of life. In a highly unusual decision, she chose to represent herself at trial, dismissing her court-appointed attorneys. This decision shocked legal observers, as representing oneself in a capital homicide trial is extraordinarily rare and almost always ends badly for the defendant. Throughout the proceedings, Moss remained largely silent, declined to cross-examine witnesses in a meaningful way, and refused to present a meaningful defence. She sat quietly at the defence table, occasionally taking notes but never addressing the court or jury directly. The prosecution presented extensive evidence of starvation, isolation, and systemic harm, including testimony from educators, investigators, and medical experts. Teachers described how Immani had appeared increasingly thin and weak before being pulled from school. Investigators detailed the conditions found in the apartment and the evidence of Immani's confinement. The jury was shown evidence establishing that Immani's loss of life was not accidental, but the predictable result of intentional denial. Medical experts explained that the level of starvation Immani experienced could only have resulted from prolonged, deliberate withholding of food. Moss's courtroom behaviour, refusing to engage with the process, became a notable feature of the trial. Legal experts speculated about her motives for self-representation. Some suggested she had given up entirely, while others wondered if she believed silence would somehow protect her. Whatever her reasoning, it proved disastrous for her case. After discussion, the jury returned a guilty verdict on all major counts in less than 2 hours. The evidence was so overwhelming, and the lack of any defence so complete, that the jury had little difficulty reaching their decision. The swift verdict reflected the strength of the prosecution's case and the absence of any credible alternative explanation for Immani's loss of life. In 2019, Tiffany Moss received a capital sentence. The judge cited several serious factors, including the duration of Immani's suffering, the victim's extreme vulnerability, and the deliberate effort to conceal the crime by destroying the body. The judge noted that Immani had suffered for months before finally passing away, and that this prolonged severe harm justified the ultimate punishment. Victim impact statements emphasised not only Immani's suffering, but also systemic failures that allowed the harm to continue after early warning signs were identified. Immani's teachers spoke about their efforts to help the child and their heartbreak that she had been removed from school before they could do more. Extended family members who had noticed Immani's declining condition but had been kept away from her by Tiffany Moss spoke about their regret at not intervening more forcefully. They described a bright, sweet girl who had been systematically destroyed by her stepmother's cruelty. Moss declined to make a statement during sentencing, maintaining the silence she had kept throughout the trial. She showed no emotion as the capital sentence was pronounced. Her lack of response only reinforced the jury's view that she felt no remorse for what she had done to Immani. The court emphasised that starvation as a method of ending the life of reflected sustained intent rather than a momentary loss of control. Unlike crimes that occur in the heat of passion, Immani's loss of life was the result of daily decisions to deny her food, to keep her isolated, to ignore her suffering. Each day that Tiffany Moss withheld food from Immani was a separate decision to continue the harm. Appeals were filed automatically under Georgia law, but Moss has not publicly advanced a narrative of innocence or cooperated with appeal attorneys. Her decision to represent herself at trial complicated the appeals process, as she made few objections that could be reviewed by higher courts. Tiffany Moss remains on death row in Georgia, with no carrying out the sentence date set. She is housed at the Arundel State Prison, where Georgia's small population of female death row inmates is held. Her case has been cited in discussions about child welfare oversight, particularly the risks associated with removing children from school after harm concerns are raised. The case underscores how prolonged neglect, when intentional, can be charged in court as capital homicide, even in the absence of a single aggressive act. It also highlights the importance of maintaining oversight of children who are withdrawn from school, especially when concerns about their welfare have already been raised. Immani's case led to renewed calls for reform in how Georgia tracks homeschooled children and monitors situations where children disappear from public view after harm allegations. However, these reforms came too late to save Immani, who passed away invisible to the very systems meant to protect her. Before we continue, hit subscribe if you appreciate deep dives into cases that don't get the attention they deserve. While Tiffany Moss's guilt was established through months of documented starvation, the next mother's conviction rests on fire science that many experts now consider fundamentally flawed, raising the question of whether Alabama may have wrongfully sentenced a woman to loss of life for a tragedy that was actually an accident. Part 4. Christy Michelle Scott. Christy Michelle Scott is a biological mother who was convicted of capital homicide for the loss of life of her 6-year-old son, Mason Scott, who passed away in a house fire in Franklin County, Alabama, on August 16th. Prosecutors allege that Scott intentionally set the fire in her son's bedroom, ending the life of Mason while rescuing her other child, motivated by financial gain through life insurance proceeds. Scott has always denied setting the fire, and her case has become a symbol of concerns about wrongful convictions based on outdated arson science. Christy Scott was married to her husband Jeremy Scott, and the couple had 2 young sons, including Mason and his younger brother. The family lived in a rural area of Franklin County, in a modest single-story home. Friends and relatives described Scott as attentive and protective of her children, with no prior allegations of harm or neglect reported to authorities. Financially, the family experienced stress normal of many working-class families in rural Alabama. Testimony established that the Scotts carried life insurance policies on their children, which prosecutors later emphasized as evidence of motive. The defense countered that such policies are common and were not unusual in amount. There were no documented domestic aggression calls, no prior Child Protective Services involvement, and no legal history involving Scott before the fire. Importantly, a previous house fire had occurred years earlier at a different residence where the family had lived. This earlier fire had been investigated and ruled accidental. However, prosecutors would later portray this as suspicious, arguing it established a pattern. The defense argued it was nothing more than an unfortunate coincidence. In the period leading up to the fatal fire, there was no documented escalation of conflict, no reported arguments, and no indication of imminent danger within the household. The night before the fire followed a routine pattern. The children were put to bed in the bedroom they shared, and the family retired for the night. During the early morning hours of August 16, 2008, a fire broke out in the bedroom shared by Scott's 2 sons. Mason Scott became trapped inside the room and passed away from smoke inhalation and burns. Scott escaped the house with her younger son and sought help. Firefighters responded but were unable to save Mason. Investigators determined that the fire originated in the children's bedroom. The prosecution alleged that the fire was intentionally set using combustible materials, though no liquid accelerant remains was for certain identified. Scott maintained that she attempted to rescue Mason, but was overcome by smoke and flames. There were no eyewitnesses to the fire's ignition. Fire investigators classified the blaze as arson, based on burn patterns, charring, and fire behaviour indicators that were standard at the time. Scott quickly became the focus of the investigation due to her presence in the home and the existence of insurance policies. Investigators also revisited the earlier house fire, treating it as evidence of a possible pattern. The defense later challenged the investigation, arguing that the conclusions relied on outdated fire science methods. By the time of Scott's trial, and certainly by the time of her appeals, fire science had undergone a revolution. Techniques that had been considered reliable for decades were now understood to be fundamentally flawed. Scott was charged with capital homicide for intentionally causing the loss of life of her child by arson. The prosecution argued that Scott set the fire for financial gain and cited the prior fire as evidence of intent. Expert witnesses testified regarding fire origin and cause, supporting the arson conclusion. The defense presented experts who disputed the reliability of the state's fire analysis. Defense experts testified that the fire could easily have been accidental, started by an electrical problem, a space heater, or any number of common household sources. They explained that the patterns the state's experts identified as proof of arson were consistent with accidental fire behavior. The jury ultimately convicted Scott. Under Alabama's capital sentencing scheme at the time, the jury recommended a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. However, Judge Terry Dempsey imposed a capital sentence, overriding the jury's recommendation, a practice unique to Alabama that has since been abolished. In sentencing Scott to loss of life, the judge emphasized the loss of life of a defenseless child and the alleged financial motive. Victim impact statements focused on the loss of Mason and the great loss to the family. However, the sentencing phase was marked by controversy, as several family members expressed doubt about Scott's guilt and opposed the capital sentence. The defense filed appeals challenging the conviction and sentence, focusing on two primary issues: the use of judicial override and the reliability of the fire science evidence presented at trial. Both issues would prove to be prescient concerns. Christy Michelle Scott remains on death row in Alabama. Her case is frequently cited in discussions about wrongful convictions based on outdated arson science and the now abolished practice of judicial override in capital cases. Advocacy groups and legal experts continue to review the forensic evidence, arguing that the conviction would likely not stand if evaluated under modern fire investigation standards. The case highlights the risks of relying on evolving scientific disciplines when determining guilt in capital prosecutions involving parents accused of ending the life of their children. Fire investigation, like many forensic disciplines, was long considered an exact science, when it was actually based more on experience and pattern recognition than rigorous scientific testing. Make sure to subscribe before the next case. Trust me, it's even more shocking than what you just heard. While Christy Scott may have been wrongfully convicted based on questionable fire science, the next mother's guilt is beyond dispute. She slowly poisoned her own teenage son to loss of life over months to collect insurance money, becoming one of the few women in American history sentence was carried out for ending the life of her child. Part 5. Judy Buenoano. Judy Buenoano was a biological mother convicted of causing the loss of life of her teenage son, Michael Buenoano, in Florida through deliberate poisoning for financial gain. The crime occurred in the late 1970s, with Michael's loss of life following a prolonged period of unexplained illness that left him paralyzed before ultimately ending the life of him. Buenoano's role as Michael's mother and primary caregiver placed her in complete control of his daily care, diet, and medication. Judy Buenoano had multiple marriages and long-term romantic relationships, many of which were tied to financial benefits, such as insurance payouts and survivor benefits. She was the mother of Michael Buenoano, who lived with her during his teenage years. Testimony established that Michael was dependent on his mother for care, particularly after he became ill and later paralyzed. Friends and acquaintances described Buenoano as outwardly attentive and devoted. She often portrayed herself as a caring mother and partner. Financially, however, she was always under strain and relied heavily on insurance proceeds and government benefits. There were no early reports of harm or police involvement related to Michael prior to his illness. Michael Buenoano began experiencing severe health problems while living with his mother in the late 1970s. His condition worsened gradually, with symptoms including weakness, gastrointestinal distress, and neurological impairment. Over time, Michael became paralyzed and required increased care, which Buenoano provided. During this period, she collected insurance and benefits connected to his condition. Evidence later showed that Buenoano had access to arsenic and other poisons, and that she administered these substances incrementally, rather than in a single dose. The prolonged nature of the poisoning masked the cause of Michael's illness and delayed suspicion. Michael Buenoano ultimately passed away in September 1980 after months of suffering. He was 19 years old. Medical records and later forensic analysis revealed that arsenic poisoning was the cause of loss of life. The poison had been administered orally over time, allowing Buenoano to control the pace of Michael's decline. Because arsenic poisoning can mimic natural illness, Michael's loss of life was initially not classified as a homicide. His loss of life certificate listed the cause as natural, related to his undiagnosed neurological condition. Buenoano collected on his life insurance policies and government loss of life benefits. She played the grieving mother, accepting condolences and sympathy from friends and community members. Suspicion arose years later when investigators began reviewing losses of life linked to Buenoano. The investigation actually began with a different case, the attempted homicide of her boyfriend, who survived a poisoning attempt. As investigators looked into Buenoano's background, they discovered a trail of suspicious losses of life. Authorities exhumed Michael's body and conducted toxicological testing, which revealed high levels of arsenic. This discovery reframed Michael's loss of life as a homicide. The arsenic levels were far too high to be explained by environmental exposure or accident. Investigators also exhumed the body of James Goodyear, Buenoano's husband, who had passed away in 1971. He too showed evidence of arsenic poisoning. Investigators linked Buenoano to access to poison and financial benefits collected after Michael's loss of life. Buenoano was charged with first-degree homicide for the loss of life of her son. The prosecution argued that she poisoned Michael deliberately to obtain insurance and financial benefits. Evidence included toxicology reports showing lethal levels of arsenic, financial records documenting insurance policies and benefits, and testimony establishing her exclusive control over Michael's care. The defense challenged the interpretation of medical evidence and argued that Michael's loss of life resulted from natural illness. The jury rejected the defense arguments, finding the poisoning evidence compelling. Buenoano was convicted of capital homicide, with the homicide of her son serving as a central serious factor in later proceedings. Buenoano was received a capital sentence. The judge emphasized the betrayal of maternal trust, the prolonged suffering inflicted on the victim, and the calculated financial motive. Victim impact testimony described Michael's slow decline and the great loss experienced by those who believed he had passed away from natural causes. Buenoano maintained her innocence and pursued multiple appeals, all of which were denied. The courts characterized her actions as cold, deliberate, and motivated by profit rather than emotion or desperation. Judy Buenoano's sentence was carried out by electric chair on March 30, 1998. She became one of the few women sentenced to death in Florida, and one of the rare cases in which a mother was sentenced for ending the life of her own child. Her case is frequently cited in discussions of serial poisoning, caregiver homicide, and financially motivated filicide. Buenoano never admitted to any of the crimes, maintaining her innocence until the end. In her final statement before carrying out the sentence, she proclaimed that she was innocent and that the state was causing the loss of life of her. She expressed no remorse for Michael or for any of her other suspected victims. If these stories are helping you understand the darker side of human nature, subscribe to see more cases we uncover. While Judy Buenoano's conviction was supported by clear forensic evidence of arsenic poisoning, the next mother's case rests on a coerced confession that many believe was false, raising the troubling possibility that Texas is holding an innocent woman on death row based on a tragedy that was actually an accident. Part 6. Melissa Lucio. Melissa Lucio is a biological mother of 14 children who was convicted of capital homicide for the loss of life of her 2-year-old daughter, Mariah Alvarez, in Harlingen, Texas, in February 2007. Prosecutors allege that Mariah passed away as a result of ongoing physical harm, while the defense has always maintained that the child's loss of life was caused by an accidental fall down a staircase days earlier. Lucio's conviction rests heavily on a confession obtained after an extended interrogation, rather than on definitive forensic proof of harm. Melissa Lucio grew up in extreme poverty and experienced domestic aggression from a young age. As an adult, she became a mother to 14 children, many of whom were raised in unstable living conditions, marked by frequent moves, overcrowded housing, and financial insecurity. Lucio herself was a survivor of long-term domestic harm by multiple partners, a factor that shaped her demeanor and responses to authority figures. Testimony established that Lucio was the primary caregiver for Mariah and her siblings. The household was chaotic, but Lucio did her best to care for all of them. Family members and acquaintances described the household as chaotic, but did not report systematic physical harm of the children. Child Protective Services had prior contact with the family, largely related to neglect concerns stemming from poverty and housing instability, rather than allegations of aggressive harm. In the days before Mariah's loss of life, the child reportedly fell down a steep staircase inside the family home. According to defense witnesses, Mariah showed signs of injury afterward, including lethargy and bruising, but was still conscious and mobile. Lucio did not seek immediate medical attention, later stating that she feared help from others by authorities due to her family's prior CPS involvement. On the day Mariah was found unresponsive, there was no reported argument, aggressive episode, or acute crisis inside the home. The morning of February 17, 2007, started like any other morning in the chaotic Lucio household. Lucio woke up and went to check on Mariah, expecting to find her daughter sleeping. Instead, she found Mariah unresponsive. Mariah Alvarez was found unresponsive and later pronounced dead. The prosecution alleged that she passed away as a result of blunt force trauma inflicted by Lucio during a pattern of harm. The defense countered that Mariah's injuries were consistent with an accidental fall down a steep staircase, followed by complications. Autopsy findings showed multiple bruises on Mariah's body, which prosecutors argued were evidence of harm. Defense experts later testified that the bruises varied in age and could be explained by normal childhood injuries combined with the reported fall. There were no eyewitnesses to an act of aggression, and no clear timeline establishing when or how the fatal injury occurred. Law enforcement became involved after emergency responders were called to the home. Mariah's loss of life triggered an immediate investigation. Lucio was taken into custody and interrogated for several hours. During this interrogation, officers repeatedly told her that she would lose her remaining children if she did not cooperate. After hours of questioning, Lucio made statements interpreted by investigators as a confession, including phrases such as, "I guess I did it." The defense later argued that these statements were not admissions of guilt, but expressions of exhaustion and submission under psychological pressure. No physical evidence directly linked Lucio to a specific act of fatal aggression. Lucio was charged with capital homicide. The prosecution's case focused on the confession and the medical examiner's conclusion that Mariah passed away from harm. The defense argued that the confession was coerced and that the medical evidence did not support intentional homicide. At trial, Lucio's attorneys presented expert testimony challenging the reliability of the interrogation. However, the jury ultimately credited the prosecution's narrative. Lucio was convicted of capital homicide. Throughout the trial, Lucio maintained that she did not intentionally harm her daughter and expressed confusion and remorse over Mariah's loss of life. Following her conviction, Lucio received a capital sentence by lethal injection. The judge cited the victim's age and vulnerability as serious factors. Lucio's defense filed multiple appeals, emphasizing the coerced nature of the confession and advances in understanding false confessions. Melissa Lucio remains on death row in Texas. In 2022, her execution was scheduled for April 27th. Just 2 days before the scheduled execution of the sentence, the Texas Court of Legal Appeals issued a stay. In 2024, Judge Arturo Nelson issued a recommendation that Lucio's conviction be overturned, concluding that she is actually innocent. The final decision now rests with the Texas Court of Legal Appeals. Lucio's case has become a central example in national discussions about false confessions, the treatment of harm survivors during police interrogations, and the risk of executing potentially innocent parents. It underscores how maternal filicide cases can hinge less on physical evidence and more on narrative framing, with life or loss of life consequences. Before we move on to the next case, make sure to subscribe if you're finding these stories as disturbing as I am. It helps us keep covering the cases that most channels won't touch. While Melissa Lucio may have been wrongfully convicted based on a coerced confession, the next mother's guilt is undeniable. She choked a pregnant woman and cut an unborn baby from her womb, becoming the first woman sentenced carried out by the federal government in nearly 70 years. Part 7. Lisa Montgomery. Lisa Marie Montgomery was a biological mother whose sentence was carried out by the US federal government for the 2004 homicide of Bobby Jo Stinnett, a pregnant woman whom Montgomery choked before cutting the unborn child from her womb. The crime occurred on December 16, 2004, inside Stinnett's home in Skidmore, Missouri, after Montgomery travelled across state lines under false pretenses. The victim passed away from strangulation, while the baby survived. This case involved one of the most brutal and premeditated acts in modern US history, and resulted in the first federal carrying out the sentence of a woman since 1953. Montgomery was born on February 27, 1968, into a profoundly abusive household, marked by chronic physical, sexual, and psychological harm beginning in early childhood. Court records documented repeated sexual assaults by her stepfather, Jack Kleiner, beginning when she was approximately 11 years old. The harm was severe and sustained, occurring regularly over several years. Montgomery's mother, Judy Buenoano, was aware of the harm but failed to protect her daughter. In fact, evidence suggested that Buenoano sometimes facilitated the harm, even allowing her husband to invite other men to sexually harm Lisa. The level of depravity in Montgomery's childhood is difficult to comprehend. As a teenager and adult, Montgomery exhibited symptoms consistent with complex post-traumatic stress disorder, dissociation, and severe depression. She experienced dissociative episodes where she would lose time and not remember what she had done. She struggled with maintaining relationships and holding employment. The trauma of her childhood had fundamentally damaged her psychological development. She became pregnant as a young adult and gave birth to a daughter, but later lost custody due to instability and mental health struggles. She married multiple times, each relationship characterized by dysfunction and often aggression. Montgomery had a pattern of unstable relationships and depended heavily on others for emotional validation. In the years leading up to the crime, she developed pseudocyesis, a false belief of pregnancy accompanied by some physical symptoms of pregnancy, even when none exists. She frequently told friends and acquaintances that she was expecting a baby, even though medical evidence showed she had undergone a tubal ligation and could not become pregnant. She had no prior relationship with Bobby Joe Stinnett. The two communicated only through online dog breeding forums, where Montgomery cultivated trust over time. Montgomery was interested in rat terrier dogs and found Stinnett through an online community of breeders. They exchanged messages about dogs, breeding, and puppies. Months before the homicide, Montgomery began telling multiple people that she was pregnant and nearing delivery, despite medical evidence to the contrary. She told her husband Kevin, her friends, and co-workers that she was expecting. As the months passed and no pregnancy became clear to see, she began wearing loose clothing and padding her midsection to create the appearance of pregnancy. She joined online forums related to rat terrier breeding and targeted pregnant women, particularly those living in isolated rural areas. Montgomery searched for pregnant women who bred dogs, looking for someone she could visit under the pretense of buying a puppy. Bobby Joe Stinnett fit her criteria perfectly. She was 8 months pregnant, she bred dogs, and she lived in a small, isolated town in rural Missouri. Her communications with Stinnett grew stronger in early December 2004, focusing on purchasing a puppy and arranging an in-person visit. Montgomery, using the alias Darlene Fisher, expressed interest in buying a specific puppy. Stinnett was eager to make the sale and agreed to meet with Montgomery at her home. In the days before the crime, Montgomery gathered supplies, including rope and a knife. She prepared for what she was about to do with a chilling calculation. She told family members she was going to pick up her newborn baby, setting up her alibi for arriving home with an infant. Mental health experts later testified that Montgomery's psychological state involved dissociation and delusional thinking centered on pregnancy and identity. She had become so invested in the false pregnancy that she could not back out of it without admitting the lie to everyone in her life. In her distorted thinking, obtaining a real baby was the only solution. On the morning of December 16, 2004, she drove from her home in Melvern, Kansas, to Skidmore, Missouri, fully aware that she was not pregnant, but determined to obtain a baby through aggression. The drive took about an hour. Montgomery had time to change her mind, to turn around, to recognize the horror of what she was planning. She did not. Montgomery arrived at Stinnett's home around noon under the pretense of buying a puppy. Bobby Joe welcomed her inside warmly, excited to show Montgomery the puppies and discuss the breeding program. The two women looked at dogs together and chatted casually. Stinnett had no reason to fear this woman who seemed interested in her dogs. After entering the residence, the two women spoke casually for perhaps 20 or 30 minutes. At some point, Montgomery harmed Stinnett from behind. She wrapped a rope around Stinnett's neck and began choking her. Stinnett fought desperately for her life and the life of her unborn child. The struggle was aggressive. Stinnett clawed at the rope, trying to get her fingers underneath it. She fought with the strength of a mother protecting her baby, but Montgomery was determined and strong, and she did not stop pulling the rope tight. She choked Stinnett until she lost consciousness, and then continued until she was dead. After ending her life, Montgomery retrieved the knife she had brought with her. She used it to cut open Stinnett's abdomen in a crude caesarean section. Montgomery had researched how to perform a caesarean section online, studying veterinary procedures for delivering puppies. She followed what she had learned, cutting through the abdominal wall and into the uterus to remove the fetus. The baby, a girl, was still alive at the time. 8-month gestational age was viable, and the baby survived the traumatic birth. Montgomery removed the infant, cutting the umbilical cord and wrapping the baby in a blanket. Montgomery left Stinnett wounded on the floor and fled the scene with the newborn. She did not call for help or show any concern for the woman she had just ended the life of. She cleaned bodily fluid from herself and the baby, wrapped the infant more securely, and drove back toward Kansas with the stolen child. The drive back took about an hour, during which time Montgomery presumably planned what she would say when she arrived home with a newborn. The crime was swift, but involved multiple deliberate steps, reflecting planning rather than sudden aggression. There were no eyewitnesses, but extensive forensic evidence documented the sequence of events. Montgomery left behind DNA evidence, fingerprints, and digital records of her communications with Stinnett. Bobby Joe Stinnett's husband, Zeb, returned home from work around 5 p.m. and discovered his wife's body. The scene was horrific beyond description. His pregnant wife lying in a pool of bodily fluid, with her abdomen cut open, the baby gone. He immediately called 911, telling the dispatcher that his wife had ended the life of and the baby taken. Law enforcement issued an Amber Alert within hours. Investigators quickly traced Montgomery through online communications between the two women and phone records related to the puppy sale. The digital trail made it relatively easy to identify Montgomery as the person who had visited Stinnett that day. Police located Montgomery at her home in Kansas later that day, approximately 5 hours after the homicide. The newborn was found alive and unharmed in Montgomery's possession. She had cleaned the baby and was showing her off to family and friends as her newborn daughter. Kevin Montgomery, Lisa's husband, apparently believed the baby was theirs, though evidence suggests he may have had suspicions about the pregnancy. Montgomery was arrested without resistance. During questioning, she initially maintained that the baby was hers, born the day before. However, medical examination quickly proved Montgomery had not recently given birth. Hospital records showed she had undergone a tubal ligation years earlier and could not become pregnant. Her claim fell apart within hours. During questioning, she made statements acknowledging her involvement, though her mental state became a central issue in later proceedings. She seemed to dissociate at times during questioning, appearing confused about what had happened. The investigation relied on digital evidence, forensic analysis of the crime scene, and witness testimony regarding Montgomery's false pregnancy claims. The evidence of premeditation was overwhelming. The months of fake pregnancy, the online stalking of pregnant women, the preparation of supplies, and the deliberate travel across state lines. Because the crime involved interstate travel and kidnapping, resulting in loss of life, Montgomery was charged in federal court. Federal jurisdiction applied because she had crossed state lines to commit the crime and had kidnapped the baby across state lines. She was charged with kidnapping resulting in loss of life, which carries the capital punishment. The defense presented extensive evidence of Montgomery's lifelong harm, severe mental illness, and dissociative episodes. The defense team brought in multiple mental health experts who evaluated Montgomery and reviewed records from her childhood. They documented the horrific harm she had suffered and explained how that trauma had fundamentally altered her brain development and mental functioning. Dr. Catherine Porterfield, a clinical psychologist, testified that Montgomery suffered from complex PTSD, dissociative disorder, and brain damage consistent with repeated head trauma. Brain scans showed abnormalities in regions responsible for impulse control and decision-making. The defense argued that Montgomery's mental state at the time of the crime was severely impaired. Multiple mental health experts testified that she suffered from PTSD and brain dysfunction. They explained that her false pregnancy belief was a delusion driven by her desperate need for emotional connection and validation. In her distorted thinking, having a baby would fix her broken life and relationships. The prosecution emphasized planning, deception, and the cruelty of the crime. They argued that mental illness, no matter how severe, did not excuse or justify what Montgomery had done. They presented evidence of her careful planning over months, her research into performing caesarean sections, and her deliberate choice of a victim. They pointed out that Montgomery had been functional enough to drive several hours, to maintain a conversation about dogs, to carry out the sentence of homicide, and to drive home with a baby. This level of functioning, they argued, demonstrated that she knew what she was doing and understood it was wrong. The jury rejected the insanity defense, finding Montgomery legally competent and responsible for her actions. Under federal law, the insanity defense requires proving that the defendant was unable to appreciate the wrongfulness of their actions due to mental disease or defect. The jury found that while Montgomery suffered from mental illness, she understood that what she was doing was wrong. She was convicted and received a capital sentence. The trial became a focal point for debate about how the federal system handles defendants with profound mental illness. The case raised fundamental questions about the intersection of trauma, mental illness, and legal responsibility. In sentencing Montgomery to loss of life, the court cited the extreme brutality of the crime, the vulnerability of the victim, and the deliberate steps taken before and after the homicide. The judge noted that Bobby Jo Stinnett was 8 months pregnant, ended the life of in her own home by someone she had trusted enough to invite inside. Victim impact statements described the permanent trauma suffered by Stinnett's family and the child who survived the incident. Zeb Stinnett spoke about the nightmare of discovering his wife's body and the horror of not knowing where his baby was. He described the ongoing trauma of knowing how his daughter came into the world. The defense pursued appeals, arguing that executing Montgomery would violate constitutional protections due to her mental illness and history of harm. They argued that executing someone with her level of brain damage and trauma history would be cruel and unusual punishment. They pointed to Supreme Court precedent prohibiting carrying out the sentence of defendants with severe mental disabilities. Clemency petitions emphasized her diminished capacity and traumatic background. Hundreds of organizations and individuals wrote letters supporting clemency, including the original prosecutor who had tried her case. Former prosecutors, mental health professionals, and anti-domestic aggression advocates all argued that Montgomery should not be sentenced. All appeals and clemency efforts were ultimately denied. The courts found that while Montgomery's history was tragic and her mental illness was severe, she met the legal standard for carrying out the sentence. She understood why she was being sentenced was carried out, which under federal law makes carrying out the sentence permissible. In October 2020, the Trump administration, which had resumed federal carrying out of sentences after a 17-year hiatus, scheduled Montgomery's carrying out the sentence for December 8, 2020. However, her attorneys obtained a temporary stay while her competency was evaluated. The question was whether she was currently competent to be sentenced, not whether she had been mentally ill at the time of the crime. The stay was brief. Courts determined Montgomery understood why she was being sentenced and that she was competent under the legal standard. A new carrying out the sentence date was set for January 12, 2021, later moved to January 13, 2021. Lisa Montgomery was sentenced to be carried out by lethal injection on January 13, 2021 at 1:31 a.m. at the Federal Correctional Complex in Terre Haute, Indiana. She was 52 years old. She was the first woman sentenced was carried out by the federal government since 1953, when Bonnie Brown Heady was sentenced was carried out for kidnapping and homicide. Montgomery was also the 11th and final person sentence was carried out during the Trump administration's unprecedented carrying out the sentence spree. Her carrying out the sentence drew international condemnation. The United Nations, the European Union, and numerous human rights organizations issued statements condemning the carrying out the sentence of a severely mentally ill, brain-damaged woman who had been brutally harmed throughout her childhood. Even the original trial prosecutor ultimately opposed her carrying out the sentence. The carrying out the sentence reignited debates about capital punishment, mental illness, and gender. Legal scholars and advocates argued that executing Montgomery was fundamentally unjust given her mental condition and trauma history. They pointed out that men with similar trauma backgrounds are rarely sentenced, raising questions about how gender affects capital punishment decisions. The case is now widely cited in discussions about the ethics of executing severely traumatized individuals and the limits of legal responsibility in cases involving dissociation and delusion. It has become a touchstone in debates about whether trauma and mental illness should preclude capital punishment. Montgomery's final words were brief. She expressed love for her family and apologized for the pain she had caused. According to witnesses, the carrying out the sentence proceeded without complications. She was pronounced dead approximately 3 minutes after the lethal drugs began flowing. Bobby Jo Stinnett remains dead, ending the life of at age 23, when she should have had her whole life ahead of her. Her daughter, Victoria Jo, survived and was raised by her father, Zeb. Victoria Jo was 16 years old at the time of Montgomery's carrying out the sentence. She knows the horrific circumstances of her birth and must live with that knowledge for the rest of her life. The case leaves us with difficult questions about justice, punishment, and mercy. Can someone who was so profoundly damaged by childhood trauma be held fully responsible for their actions as an adult? Does executing someone with severe mental illness serve justice, or simply add another victim? These questions have no easy answers. If you're still watching at this point, make sure you're subscribed. We cover cases like this every week, and your support helps us keep going. Part 8. Aileen Wuornos. Aileen Carol Wuornos was a biological mother who, years after giving birth to a child she never raised, became one of the most notorious female serial killers in American history. Between November 1989 and November 1990, Wuornos caused the loss of life of 7 adult men in Florida after encounters that began as acts of roadside prostitution. The acts occurred in vehicles and remote wooded areas along Florida highways. Wuornos claimed that the first ending the life of was committed in self-defense following sexual harm, but prosecutors established a pattern of premeditated robbery and carrying out the sentence-style shootings. Her case demonstrates that biological motherhood does not inherently prevent extreme aggression, and it culminated in multiple loss-of-life sentences and carrying out the sentence. Wuornos was born on February 29, 1956 in Rochester, Michigan, into a deeply unstable family environment. Her father, Leo Dale Pittman, was a convicted child sex offender who was diagnosed as schizophrenic. He was imprisoned for the harm and attempted homicide of a 7-year-old girl. He later passed away by self-harm while incarcerated in 1969, hanging himself in his prison cell. Wuornos never knew her father. He was in prison before she was born, and Diane Wuornos, Aileen's mother, abandoned both Aileen and her older brother Keith when Aileen was just 4 years old. Diane left them with her parents, Laurie and Britta Wuornos, who legally adopted the children. Court records and later psychological evaluations documented physical harm by her grandfather and severe neglect within the household. Laurie Wuornos was an alcoholic who beat Aileen with a leather belt and exposed her to other forms of physical punishment. The household was characterized by aggression, alcoholism, and emotional coldness. Aileen later reported that she was never shown affection or love by her adoptive parents. The harm extended beyond physical aggression. According to testimony from Aileen and corroborating witnesses, she was sexually harmed by her grandfather's friend, beginning when she was very young. She also engaged in sexual acts with her brother Keith, though the nature of this relationship and whether it was consensual or coercive remains disputed. As a teenager, Wuornos engaged in survival sex, trading sexual favors for cigarettes, drugs, and money. She became sexually active at an extremely young age and quickly learned that her body was a commodity she could use for survival. She lived from time to time on the streets or in the woods near her neighborhood, often preferring the outdoors to her abusive home. At age 14, she became pregnant after being sexually harmed by a friend of her grandfather. There are conflicting accounts about whether this was a single harm or an ongoing situation. In March 1971, at age 14, she gave birth to a son at a home for unwed mothers. The baby was immediately placed for adoption. Wuornos had no say in this decision. As a minor, the choice was made for her. She never held her baby, never learned his name, and had no further contact with him. The adoption records were sealed. This traumatic experience of pregnancy, childbirth, and forced separation from her baby further destabilized Wuornos' already precarious life. Shortly after giving birth, Wuornos dropped out of school. Her grandmother Britta passed away, and her grandfather threw Aileen out of the house. At 15 years old, she was homeless, living in the woods and abandoned cars, supporting herself through prostitution. She had no family support, no education beyond 9th grade, and no marketable skills other than sex work. As an adult, Wuornos lived a transient lifestyle marked by homelessness, prostitution, and repeated arrests for theft, drunk driving, and other petty crimes. She moved from place to place, never establishing roots or stability. She drank heavily, used drugs, and engaged in increasingly risky behavior. In the late 1980s, she entered a relationship with Tyria Moore, a 24-year-old woman she met at a gay bar in Daytona Beach. Moore became the most significant relationship of Wuornos' life. Wuornos was deeply attached to Moore, who later became a central witness in the investigation. Wuornos had no stable employment, no permanent residence, and relied on prostitution for income at the time the crimes began. She worked along the highways of central Florida, flagging down men and offering sex for money. She was known among truckers and other men who frequented prostitutes in the area. By late 1989, Wuornos was living along Florida highways, supporting herself through roadside prostitution. She and Tyria Moore moved frequently between cheap motels, often unable to pay rent and evicted. They survived day to day, with Wuornos bringing in money through prostitution while Moore, by most accounts, did not work. Their relationship was codependent, with Wuornos increasingly desperate to maintain Moore's affection and attention. The first homicide occurred on November 30th, 1989. The victim was Richard Mallory, a 51-year-old electronics repair shop owner from Clearwater. Mallory picked up Wuornos, and they drove to a secluded wooded area. Wuornos later claimed that Mallory violently harmed her and that she fired at him in self-defense. According to Wuornos' account, Mallory became aggressive, produced alcohol and possibly drugs, and then brutally harmed her. She said she feared for her life and fired at him when she had the opportunity. However, investigators found evidence that suggested the ending the life of was more calculated than Wuornos claimed. Mallory was fired multiple times with a .22 caliber pistol. The shots were grouped in his chest and torso, suggesting deliberate aim rather than panicked defensive shooting incident. After ending his life, Wuornos took his car, money and personal belongings. She drove his car for several days before abandoning it. Instead of reporting the alleged harm to police, Wuornos took Mallory's car and personal belongings, using them for transportation and financial gain. This behaviour raised questions about her self-defence claim. If she had truly been defending herself from an aggressive incident, why not go to authorities? Why steal the victim's property? Following this initial ending, the Wuornos continued to solicit men, enter their vehicles and fire at them at close range. The pattern established with Mallory repeated itself 6 more times over the next year. The acts escalated over the next year, both in frequency and confidence. Financial desperation remained constant, but investigators later argued that Wuornos developed a pattern of using lethal force as a means of robbery. The second victim was David Spears, a 43-year-old construction worker, who ended his life on May 19, 1990. His body was found in a wooded area off Highway 19. He had been fired at 6 times with a .22 caliber item. His truck was found abandoned miles away. The third victim was Charles Carskadden, a 40-year-old part-time rodeo worker, who ended his life on June 1, 1990. His body was discovered along State Road 52 in Pasco County. He had been fired 9 times. His personal belongings, including his car, jewellery, and money, were missing. The fourth victim was Troy Barres, a 50-year-old sausage salesman who ended the life of on July 30, 1990. His body wasn't discovered until August 4th, found in a wooded area in Marion County. He had been fired at twice in the chest and once in the back. His delivery truck was found abandoned. The fifth victim was Charles Dick Humphreys, a 56-year-old retired Air Force major and former police chief, who ended the life of on September 11, 1990. His body was found fully clothed in Marion County. He had been fired 7 times. His car was found days later, abandoned. The sixth victim was Walter Gino Antonio, a 62-year-old truck driver and security guard, who ended his life on November 19, 1990. His nearly nude body was found in a remote area northwest of Cross City. He had been fired 4 times in the back and head. His car was recovered shortly after, stripped of valuables. The seventh and final victim was Peter Seams, a 65-year-old retired merchant seaman and Christian missionary who died on June 7, 1990. Unlike the other victims, Seams's body was never found. However, his car was recovered after witnesses reported seeing 2 women in the vehicle, a crucial break in the case that would lead to Wuornos and Moore's identification. Her relationship with Tyria Moore deepened during this period, and Wuornos reportedly confessed details of the acts to Moore. Evidence suggested that Wuornos was motivated partly by a desire to provide money for Moore and to maintain their relationship. The more desperate Wuornos became to keep Moore's affection, the more willing she was to end the life for money. There was no evidence that Moore participated directly in the crimes or even knew about them initially, though she later testified that Wuornos had confessed to her and that she suspected Wuornos was ending the life of men. Moore never went to police with this information, continuing to benefit from the money and stolen property Wuornos brought home. Wuornos caused the loss of life of 7 men by shooting them multiple times with a .22 caliber handgun. The item was small and required multiple shots to end the life of, which is why the victims all sustained numerous gunshot wounds. Most victims were fired at close range, either inside their vehicles or shortly after being lured to secluded locations. Autopsies revealed carrying out the sentence-style wounds, often to the chest and head. The fires at patterns suggested the victims had not been expecting the incident. There was no evidence of defensive wounds on most victims, suggesting they had not seen the incident coming or had not had time to react. After ending the life of the victims, Wuornos stole their vehicles, money, and personal items. She typically drove the stolen vehicles for a day or two before abandoning them, often in different counties from where the crimes occurred. She pawned victims' belongings, used their credit cards, and kept their cash. The stolen property provided crucial evidence linking the crimes together and eventually leading to Wuornos. Bodies were abandoned in wooded areas or left inside vehicles, often partially concealed but not carefully hidden. Wuornos made minimal effort to hide the bodies, sometimes covering them with a carpet or dragging them a short distance from the road, but not burying them or attempting serious hiding. The crimes occurred over approximately 12 months, with each ending the life of following a similar pattern of solicitation, isolation, shooting incident, and theft. The geographical pattern was focused in central and northern Florida, along major highways and in rural areas where bodies might not be discovered immediately. There were no eyewitnesses to the crimes themselves, but forensic evidence established consistency across the crime scenes. Ballistics testing would later prove that the same .22 caliber pistol was used in multiple crimes, definitively linking the acts to a single person who did it. While Wuornos claimed fear and self-defense, investigators found no physical evidence supporting ongoing harm in the later acts. Most victims were fully clothed when found. There was no evidence of sexual harm on the victims. The victims' wounds were consistent with robbery-homicide, not self-defense. The investigation progressed as victims were reported missing and their vehicles were traced. The break in the case came when witnesses reported seeing 2 women driving Peter Seam's distinctive 1988 Pontiac Sunbird. The car was later found crashed and abandoned. Witnesses provided descriptions of 2 women who had been seen in the vehicle, and police artists created composite sketches. Surveillance footage and transaction records showed Wuornos pawning personal items belonging to the victims. Florida law required pawn shops to record transactions and obtain thumbprints, which created a paper trail. Fingerprint analysis linked Wuornos to stolen property from multiple victims. Items belonging to Richard Mallory, including his camera and radar detector, were traced to pawn shops where Wuornos had sold them. The pawn shop records included her thumbprint and signature, providing definitive proof of her possession of the victim's property shortly after their loss of life. Tyria Moore became a person of interest as investigators traced the connections. Police located Moore first through family connections and offered her immunity from prosecution in exchange for cooperation. She agreed to cooperate by recording phone conversations with Wuornos, during which Wuornos admitted to committing multiple acts. These recorded conversations became key evidence. In them, Wuornos told Moore that she was in trouble, that the police were after her, and that she had ended the life of the men. She urged Moore not to worry, saying she would take full responsibility. Moore expressed concern but did not discourage Wuornos or express moral outrage at the crimes. Wuornos was arrested on January 9, 1991, at a biker bar called The Last Resort in Harbor Oaks, Florida. She was initially arrested on an outstanding warrant for an items violation, giving investigators time to build their homicide case. During questioning, she initially denied involvement in the crimes. As evidence mounted, she confessed to ending the life of the 7 men, but claimed self-defense in each case. She insisted that each man had harmed her, or attempted to harm her, and that she had fired at them to protect herself. However, investigators found this story implausible, given the pattern of the acts and the theft that followed each homicide. Later, Wuornos would recount her self-defense claims, stating that she had ended the life of the men for their money, and that she had made up the harm stories. In interviews, she admitted that she had become comfortable with ending the life of, and that it was easier than continuing to work as a prostitute. However, She would later return to the self-defense narrative at various times. Ballistics testing linked the same .22 caliber Colt Mustang weapon device to multiple acts, strengthening the prosecution's case. The weapon device, which Wuornos admitted to owning, was never recovered, but shell casings from the crime scenes matched each other, proving they came from the same item. Wuornos was tried separately for multiple crimes, beginning with the Richard Mallory case in January 1992. The prosecution charged her with first-degree homicide, arguing that she had lured Mallory to a secluded location with the specific intent to rob and end the life of him. The defense argued that she acted in self-defense due to a history of sexual aggression and fear of male clients. Defense attorneys presented evidence of Wuornos's traumatic background, the childhood harm, the harm at 14, years of aggression experienced as a prostitute. They brought in psychological experts who testified regarding her traumatic history and mental instability. They argued that her fear of men, based on a lifetime of victimization, was reasonable, and that her response to Mallory's alleged incident was genuine self-defense. However, the prosecution presented evidence that seriously undermined the self-defense claim. Unknown to the defense at the time, Richard Mallory had served 10 years in prison for aggressive harm. This information was not admitted at trial, a fact that would later become a significant issue in appeals. Ironically, the one victim where Wuornos's self-defense claim might have had credibility was the one where such evidence was unavailable to her defense. The prosecution countered by presenting forensic evidence, patterns of theft, and testimony from Moore. Prosecutors argued that if Wuornos had truly been defending herself, she would not have stolen the victim's property, sold it, and used their vehicles. The theft demonstrated that robbery, not self-defense, was the motive. Jurors were shown evidence that Wuornos repeatedly used the victims' cars and sold their belongings after the acts. Credit card records showed Wuornos using victims' credit cards for purchases. Pawnshop records documented her selling victims' property. The pattern of theft was undeniable and inconsistent with self-defense. The self-defense claim was rejected. The jury convicted Wuornos of first-degree homicide in the Mallory case after deliberating for less than 2 hours. The evidence was overwhelming, and her self-defense story was not credible given the circumstances. She was subsequently tried and convicted for 5 additional crimes. Wuornos was convicted of first-degree homicide and received a capital sentence for 6 of the acts. She received 6 loss-of-life sentences total. During the proceedings, she displayed erratic behaviour, including courtroom outbursts and accusations against judges and attorneys. Her behaviour became increasingly unstable and paranoid as the trials progressed. She fired her attorneys repeatedly, accused her lawyers of conspiring against her, and made bizarre statements to the court. At one point, she claimed that the police, prosecutors, and even her own lawyers were all part of a conspiracy to railroad her. Her mental decline was clear to everyone in the courtroom. In sentencing Wuornos to loss of life, judges emphasised the serial nature of the acts, the financial motives, and the lack of immediate threat in most encounters. The judges found that the crimes were cold, calculated, and committed for pecuniary gain, all serious factors under Florida capital punishment law. Victim impact statements described the great loss caused to families who lost fathers, husbands, and sons. The families spoke about men who had simply been driving along the highway, who had made the fatal mistake of offering a ride to a woman who appeared to be in need, who had been sentenced for the money in their wallets. Wuornos dismissed multiple attorneys and ultimately waived her remaining appeals. By the late 1990s, Wuornos had given up on the legal process. She became convinced that she would never be freed, and that continuing appeals only prolonged her suffering. She publicly stated that she wanted the sentence to be carried out, and made statements claiming that the justice system was conspiring against her. In interviews with journalists and documentarians, Wuornos expressed her desire to pass away with dignity rather than continue rotting in prison. She said she was tired of fighting, tired of the appeals process, and ready to pass away. Her acceptance of carrying out the sentence became a defining feature of the case's final phase. She gave interviews to documentarian Nick Broomfield, in which she alternated between claiming innocence and confessing guilt, between expressing remorse and displaying no emotion. These interviews revealed a deeply disturbed woman who had given up on life and was ready for carrying out the sentence. Aileen Wuornos' sentence was carried out by lethal injection on October 9, 2002, at Florida State Prison. She was 46 years old. In her final statement, she said, "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus, June 6th, like the movie, big mothership and all. I'll be back. The cryptic final statement reflected her bad mental state. According to witnesses, the carrying out the sentence proceeded without complications. She was pronounced dead at 9:47 a.m., approximately 7 minutes after the lethal drugs began flowing. Her case has been extensively studied in criminology, psychology, and gender studies. Wuornos became the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and films, most notably the 2003 film Monster, in which Charlize Theron won an Academy Award for her portrayal of Wuornos. The film presented Wuornos somewhat sympathetically, emphasising her traumatic background and suggesting that at least the first ending of the life of may have been self-defense. The case sparked debates about whether Wuornos was a victim who became a victimizer, or simply a predatory serial person responsible who happened to be female. Some feminists and advocates for harm survivors argued that Wuornos was a product of a lifetime of male aggression, and that her crimes, while inexcusable, were understandable in that context. Others, including prosecutors and victims' families, rejected this narrative entirely, arguing that Wuornos was a calculated serial person responsible who caused the loss of life for profit, and that her gender and victimization history should not excuse or explain her actions. They pointed out that many people experience trauma without becoming serial killers. The case remains one of the most widely recognized female serial person responsible cases in history. Wuornos' status as a biological mother is often cited in analyses that challenge assumptions about motherhood as a protective factor against extreme legal behavior. The fact that she had given birth did not make her any less capable of aggression. Her story raises uncomfortable questions about the relationship between childhood trauma and adult aggression, about whether someone who has been victimized their entire life can be held fully accountable when they become a victimizer, and about whether capital punishment should be applied to someone so clearly damaged by their life experiences. Before we continue, hit subscribe if you appreciate deep dives into cases that don't get the attention they deserve. While Aileen Wuornos ended the life of strangers for money after years of trauma and survival on the streets, the next mother poisoned the people closest to her, family members who trusted her completely, becoming the first woman sentence carried out in America after capital punishment was reinstated. Part 9. Velma Barfield. Velma Margie Barfield was a biological mother who became the first woman sentence carried out in the United States after the modern reinstatement of capital punishment in 1976. Between the mid-1970s and 1978 in North Carolina, Barfield poisoned people closest to her, family members and a romantic partner, using arsenic administered through food and medicine. The capital case that led to her capital sentence centered on the homicide of her boyfriend Stuart Taylor, whose loss of life was later linked to deliberate poisoning. This case shows how a mother and caregiver exploited intimate access and trust to commit serial poisonings, culminating in carrying out the sentence. Velma Barfield was born Margie Velma Bullard on October 29, 1932, in rural North Carolina during the Great Depression. She was raised in a poor farming family and described a childhood marked by poverty and her father's alcoholism. She later claimed that her father had sexually harmed her, though this was never corroborated, and family members disputed the claim. She married Thomas Burke in 1949 at age 17 and had 4 children with him: Ronnie, Kim, Vanessa, and Pam. The marriage was troubled from the start. Thomas was an alcoholic who was sometimes aggressive. The family struggled financially, moving frequently and living in poverty. She had 1 son, Ronnie, and 3 daughters. The family dynamics were characterized by instability and Thomas's drinking problem. Despite the difficulties, Velma presented herself as a devoted wife and mother to those outside the family. She was active in church and appeared to be managing as well as could be expected given her circumstances. In 1963, Velma's life changed dramatically. In 1969, Thomas Burke passed away in a house fire. The loss of life was ruled accidental at the time. Thomas had been drinking heavily and apparently passed out while smoking in bed. The fire started in the bedroom where he was sleeping. He passed away from smoke inhalation before anyone could reach him. Following her husband's loss of life, Velma began to spiral. She started taking prescription medications, initially for anxiety and headaches. Over time, she developed an addiction to prescription painkillers and tranquilizers, particularly Valium and other benzodiazepines. The addiction would control her life for years. She married Jennings Barfield in 1970, but the marriage lasted only a few months before Jennings passed away of apparent heart failure in 1971. His loss of life was not initially considered suspicious, though investigators would later wonder whether it had been natural. No autopsy was performed at the time. After Jennings's loss of life, Barfield moved frequently and relied on family members and romantic partners for housing and support. She had no stable employment and lived mostly on social security benefits and assistance from her children. She presented herself as a woman down on her luck, deserving of help and sympathy. Those who knew Barfield described her as quiet, helpful, and dependable, especially in caregiving roles. She often volunteered to care for elderly or ill relatives and acquaintances. She would cook for them, clean for them, and administer their medications. She positioned herself as indispensable to those she cared for. There were no early legal convictions for aggression. Barfield had no legal record beyond minor issues. She was known in her community as a church-going woman who had experienced hardship but persevered. Financial insecurity was persistent, and she was constantly worried about money for her prescription drug habit. Relationships frequently overlapped with sudden, unexplained illnesses among people she cared for, patterns that were only recognised retrospectively. Looking back, investigators would see that wherever Barfield went, mysterious illnesses followed. In 1974, Barfield went to work for an elderly couple, Montgomery and Dolly Edwards, caring for Mrs. Edwards, who was in poor health. In January 1974, both of the Edwardses became violently ill. Montgomery Edwards passed away on January 31, 1974, and Dolly Edwards passed away on March 3, 1974. Their losses of life were attributed to natural causes, gastroenteritis, and complications from existing health conditions. In 1977, Barfield's mother, Lily Bullard, passed away suddenly after a brief illness characterized by vomiting and diarrhea. Barfield had been caring for her mother, preparing her meals and giving her medicine. Lily's loss of life was attributed to natural causes, given her age and existing health problems. No autopsy was performed. In the years preceding the capital homicide, Barfield's dependence on others grew stronger, as did her need for money to support her drug habit. She was spending significant amounts on prescription medications, obtaining them from multiple doctors and pharmacies. She had ready access to arsenic through household products and rat poison commonly available at the time. The build-up to Stuart Taylor's homicide did not involve overt conflict. Instead, it was characterized by quiet routine, shared meals, caregiving, and increasing illness. Barfield had begun a relationship with Stuart Taylor in 1977. Taylor was a widower who lived on his farm in rural Bladen County. He was financially stable, owned his home and land, and had a regular income. With Stuart Taylor, Barfield lived in his home and depended on him financially. She presented herself as a devoted companion who cared for him and managed his household. As Taylor became ill, Barfield assumed primary caregiving duties, preparing his meals and managing his medications. Prosecutors later argued that Barfield's motive combined financial need with the desire to maintain housing and support. Taylor had discovered that Barfield had been forging checks on his account to get money for her drug habit. He confronted her about the theft, and she feared he would report her to the police or end their relationship. There were no dramatic triggers clear to outsiders. To neighbours and friends, Stuart and Velma seemed like a normal couple. The escalation was slow and hidden behind symptoms that mimicked gastrointestinal disease. Taylor began feeling sick in late January 1978, experiencing nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. Stuart Taylor fell violently ill in February 1978, suffering from severe vomiting, diarrhea, and dehydration. Barfield prepared his food during this period, and she was the one who made sure he took his medications. Taylor's condition worsened over days rather than hours, consistent with arsenic poisoning administered in multiple doses. The symptoms of arsenic poisoning, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal pain, mimic many common illnesses, which is why arsenic was historically a poison of choice. Victims and their doctors often attributed the symptoms to food poisoning, stomach flu, or other digestive problems. He passed away on February 3, 1978, at Southeastern General Hospital in Lumberton, North Carolina. He was 56 years old. Initially, his loss of life was not treated as suspicious. Doctors attributed his loss of life to gastroenteritis and related complications. A loss of life certificate was issued, and Taylor was buried. Investigators later determined that arsenic had been administered orally over time, likely mixed into food or drink. This method ensured control and hiding, producing prolonged suffering without clear-to-see trauma. The victim would become increasingly sick over days, giving the poisoner time to play the concerned caregiver. Similar illness to loss of life patterns were later identified in other losses of life connected to Barfield. This included the losses of life of the Edwardses, Barfield's mother, and potentially her second husband, Jennings Barfield. The pattern was unmistakable once investigators knew what to look for. People became sick while in Barfield's care. She nursed them through their illness, and they passed away. Suspicion arose not immediately after Taylor's loss of life, but when Taylor's family began asking questions. They found evidence that Barfield had been forging checks on Taylor's account, both before and after his loss of life. They reported this to authorities, which triggered a closer look at the circumstances of Taylor's loss of life. Authorities ordered an autopsy and exhumation of Stuart Taylor's body. Toxicology tests revealed lethal levels of arsenic in his tissue samples. The arsenic levels were far too high to be explained by environmental exposure. The pattern of distribution in his body showed that he had ingested arsenic multiple times over a period of days. Following this discovery, authorities obtained permission to exhume the bodies of other people who had passed away while in Barfield's care. Toxicology tests on the Edwardses and on Lily Bullard also revealed arsenic poisoning. The pattern was established. Barfield had been poisoning people for years. Investigators traced Barfield's access to arsenic through purchases of rat poison and other products. They documented her presence during meals and medication times, preceding the illnesses of all the victims. They established financial motives for each homicide. The Edwardses had paid her for caregiving, her mother had insurance and property, and Taylor had money she needed. Barfield was arrested in April 1978 and charged with Stuart Taylor's homicide. During questioning, she initially denied any wrongdoing, but when confronted with the toxicology evidence, she confessed. She admitted to poisoning Taylor and later admitted to poisoning her mother and the Edwardses. She claimed she had not intended to end the lives of them, only to make them sick so she could continue caring for them and collecting money. These confessions, combined with toxicology results and pattern evidence, formed the backbone of the prosecution's case. There was no evidence of accidental exposure to arsenic. The doses were deliberate and repeated. The timing of the poisonings coincided with financial need or the threat of discovery. Barfield was charged with first-degree homicide for the loss of life of Stuart Taylor. North Carolina prosecutors decided to try her only for Taylor's homicide, the most recent and clear-cut case. The prosecution emphasized arsenic toxicology, showing lethal levels of poison, Barfield's confessions to multiple poisonings, and the pattern of losses of life among those she cared for. The defense argued addiction, impaired judgment, and the absence of intent to end the life of. They presented Barfield's prescription drug addiction as a mitigating factor, arguing that her judgment was impaired by years of drug harm. They called her a tragic figure, not an evil one. A woman whose addiction had led her down a terrible path. Defense attorneys presented evidence of Barfield's difficult life. They described her childhood poverty, her father's harm, her first husband's alcoholism and aggression, and her descent into prescription drug addiction. They argued that she deserved mercy, not loss of life. They presented her as a church-going woman who had become a Christian while in jail and who was genuinely remorseful. The jury found the evidence conclusive and returned a guilty verdict after deliberating for approximately 5 hours. The trial highlighted the danger of caregiver access and the difficulty of detecting poisonings that resemble natural illness. Barfield's confessions were admitted and weighed heavily by the court, eliminating any doubt about her guilt. Barfield received a capital sentence on December 2, 1978. The judge cited the betrayal of trust, the vulnerability of victims, and the calculated nature of poisoning as serious factors. The judge noted that arsenic poisoning caused prolonged suffering, that Barfield had watched her victims suffer, and that she had continued to poison them, even as they begged for help. Victim impact statements described shock and great loss upon learning that losses of life once believed natural were homicides. Taylor's family spoke about their trust in Barfield and their horror at discovering she had caused the loss of life of him. The Edwards family expressed similar sentiment. Barfield's own children were torn, devastated by their mother's crimes but still loving her. While incarcerated awaiting carrying out the sentence, Barfield underwent a religious conversion and expressed remorse. She became a born-again Christian, spent her days reading the Bible and counselling other inmates, and granted interviews in which she expressed deep regret for her actions. She wrote letters to the families of her victims, asking for forgiveness. Appeals were filed but ultimately denied. Barfield's attorneys argued that executing her would serve no purpose, that she had been transformed by her faith, and that she posed no threat to society. They presented letters from prison staff, chaplains, and other inmates describing her positive influence on death row. The sentence drew national attention due to the rarity of females carrying out sentences and the caregiver-poisoner profile of the crimes. As Barfield's carrying out the sentence date approached, a national debate erupted about whether it was appropriate to carry out the sentence a woman, particularly one who had found religion and expressed remorse. Religious leaders, including Billy Graham, asked for clemency. Thousands of people wrote letters to the governor, asking him to commute her sentence to life. Feminist groups were divided. Some argued that executing a woman was inherently wrong, while others argued that refusing to carry out the sentence would be sexist, suggesting women should not be held equally accountable for their crimes. On November 2, 1984, Velma Barfield was sentenced to be carried out by lethal injection at Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina. She was 52 years old. She became the first woman sentence carried out in the United States after the capital punishment's reinstatement in 1976, a milestone that reignited debate about capital punishment and gender. In her final hours, Barfield received visits from her children and her pastor. Her last meal consisted of cheese doodles and Coca-Cola, a surprisingly mundane choice for a last meal. She spent her final hours praying and reading the Bible. Her final statement was delivered at 2 a.m, shortly before the carrying out the sentence. "I want to say that I am sorry for all the hurt that I have caused. I know that everybody has gone through a lot of pain, all the families connected, and I am sorry, and I want to thank everybody who has been supporting me all these 6 years." According to witnesses, the carrying out of the sentence proceeded without complications. Barfield was pronounced dead at 2:15 a.m. Her carrying out the sentence was witnessed by family members of her victims, reporters, and state officials. Some witnesses described her as appearing peaceful, while others noted that she seemed frightened despite her faith. Her case remains a foundational example in studies of serial poisoning, caregiver homicide, and the forensic challenges of detecting slow-acting toxins. The Barfield case demonstrated how poisoners exploit positions of trust, and how difficult it is to detect poisoning when symptoms mimic natural illness. The case also highlighted the forensic advances needed to detect arsenic poisoning. Following Barfield's case, medical examiners became more alert to the possibility of poisoning in cases involving mysterious illnesses, particularly when the patient was being cared for by someone who benefited financially from their loss of life. Velma Barfield carrying out the sentence established that gender alone would not protect women from capital punishment. While the rarity of female carrying out of sentences continued, the principle was established that women who committed particularly heinous crimes could and would be sentenced was carried out just as men were. Her story remains a cautionary tale about addiction, poverty, and the potential for ordinary people to commit extraordinary evil. Barfield was not a monster in appearance. She was a grandmother, a church member, someone who appeared kind and caring. Her crimes demonstrated that predators come in all forms, and that the most dangerous killers may be the ones we trust most. Make sure to subscribe before the next case. Trust me, it's even more shocking than what you just heard. While Velma Barfield's capital sentence was upheld despite her religious conversion and widespread clemency appeals, the final mother on this list had her capital sentence overturned, but she remains in prison for allegedly burning her husband and 2 daughters alive in their home, convicted largely on circumstantial evidence and fire science that many now question. Part 10. Robin Lee Rowe. Robin Lee Rowe was a biological mother who originally received a capital sentence for the homicide of her husband and 2 young daughters in Idaho, making her the only woman in the state's history to receive a capital sentence. The crimes occurred on February 10, 1992, when a fire broke out in the family's home in Boise. John Rowe, aged 34, and the couple's 2 daughters, Tabitha Rowe, aged 10, and Stephanie Rowe, age 8, passed away in the blaze. Prosecutors alleged that Rowe intentionally set the fire to end the life of her family in order to collect insurance money. Although she was convicted and received a capital sentence, her sentence was later overturned and reduced to life imprisonment. Robin Rowe married John Rowe in the early 1980s when both were young. By most accounts, the marriage started well. They had 2 daughters together and settled in Boise, Idaho, where John worked in construction and Robin stayed home with the children. Friends and neighbours described them as a normal American family. By the time of the crimes in 1992, The marriage was marked by significant instability. Court testimony revealed that the family was under severe financial strain, carrying multiple debts and struggling to maintain their lifestyle. They had credit card debt, car loans, and were behind on various bills. Rowe worked from time to time at various jobs, while John Rowe handled most of the household income through his construction work. However, John's income was inconsistent due to the seasonal nature of construction work and economic downturns in the early 1990s. The family lived beyond their means, spending more than John earned and accumulating debt. Witnesses described the marriage as tense, with frequent arguments over money. Neighbours reported hearing John and Robin fighting, though the arguments were apparently about finances rather than aggression or infidelity. There was no documented history of physical harm toward the children, and acquaintances described the girls as closely bonded to their mother. Tabitha and Stephanie were described as happy, normal girls. They attended school regularly, had friends, and participated in normal childhood activities. Teachers reported no concerns about their welfare. The girls appeared to love both their parents and showed no signs of harm or neglect. However, Rowe's relationships outside the marriage, including at least one extramarital affair, were later introduced at trial to suggest instability and possible motive for wanting to be free of her marriage. Prosecutors argued that Rowe wanted out of the marriage and the financial problems, but wanted the insurance money more than she wanted a divorce. There were no prior police reports of domestic aggression or CPS involvement before the fire. The Rowes had never come to the attention of Child Protective Services or law enforcement. By all outward appearances, they were a struggling but intact family, trying to manage financial difficulties like millions of other American families. In the months leading up to the fire, financial pressure grew stronger significantly. The family was at risk of losing their home to foreclosure. Credit card companies were threatening legal action. Bill collectors called constantly. The stress was taking a toll on both John and Robin. Evidence introduced at trial showed that Robin Rowe had recently increased life insurance coverage on her husband and children. She had taken out new policies and increased the value of existing policies. The total insurance coverage on John was approximately $320,000, and each daughter was insured for around $50,000. Prosecutors argued that this change, combined with mounting debt, formed the primary motive for homicide. They presented evidence that Robin had initiated the insurance changes without John's full knowledge of the amounts. The timing, just a few months before the fire, appeared suspicious. The defense countered that increasing insurance coverage while you have young children is not unusual or suspicious. They argued that many families carry life insurance on all family members, and that the amounts, while substantial, were not exorbitant for a family trying to protect itself financially. The night before the fire followed a routine pattern, with no reports of arguments or unusual behaviour. February 9th, 1992 was a Sunday. The family had spent a quiet day at home. John had worked on a project in the garage. The girls had played and done homework. Robin had prepared meals and managed household tasks. By all accounts, it was an ordinary day. There were no witnesses to suggest immediate conflict or emotional breakdown. Neighbours reported nothing out of the ordinary. The family went to bed at their normal times. John and Robin slept in their bedroom. The girls slept in bedrooms down the hall. The prosecution's theory was that Rowe waited until the family was asleep before setting the fire. They argued that she deliberately chose a time when her family would be most defenceless, unable to escape. The defence countered that there was no evidence of planning, such as accelerant purchases or prior threats, and emphasised the absence of a clear triggering event. In the early morning hours of February 10, 1992, a fire erupted inside the Rowe family home. The fire started sometime around 4 a.m. A neighbour noticed flames and called 911 around 4:15 a.m. By the time fire trucks arrived, the house was fully engulfed. John Rowe and the two children were trapped inside and passed away from smoke inhalation and burns. Firefighters made every effort to enter the home and search for victims, but the intensity of the fire and the structural damage made it extremely dangerous. When they were finally able to enter, they found 3 bodies. John Rowe was found in the master bedroom. He had apparently been overcome by smoke before he could escape. The girls were found in their bedrooms, also overcome by smoke. All 3 victims passed away from a combination of smoke inhalation and thermal injuries. Robin Rowe escaped the house with only minor smoke inhalation and was physically unharmed otherwise. According to her account, she woke up smelling smoke, realised the house was on fire, and managed to get out through a window. She claimed she tried to get to her daughter's rooms, but was driven back by smoke and flames. Neighbours who witnessed the fire and its aftermath reported that Robin seemed confused and disoriented, screaming for her family. Some interpreted this as genuine panic and grief. Others, with the benefit of hindsight and the prosecution's theory, later questioned whether her reactions were genuine. Fire investigators were called to examine the scene once the fire was extinguished and the structure was safe to enter. They spent days examining the remains of the house, trying to determine the fire's origin and cause. Fire investigators concluded that the blaze was intentionally set. They cited burn patterns, the depth of charring in certain areas, and the intensity and spread of the fire as proof of arson. They testified that they found evidence of multiple points of origin, which they argued proved the fire had been deliberately set. Specifically, investigators claimed to have identified pour patterns on the floor that indicated an accelerant had been used. They pointed to areas of intense burning that they believed were inconsistent with an accidental fire. They concluded that the fire had been set deliberately in multiple locations to ensure it would spread quickly and prevent escape. Prosecutors alleged that Rowe ignited the fire after ensuring her family was asleep, using some form of accelerant to guarantee the fire would spread rapidly. They theorized that she set fires in multiple locations, then escaped through a window, leaving her family to pass away. There were no eyewitnesses to the fire's ignition, and no accelerant remains was for certain identified through chemical testing. This became a significant issue. If accelerant had been used as investigators claimed, chemical tests should have detected it. The absence of a confirmed accelerant was problematic for the prosecution's theory. The losses of life occurred rapidly once the fire spread, leaving no opportunity for rescue once the fire reached a certain point. Smoke inhalation would have rendered the victims unconscious within minutes, meaning they likely never woke up or knew what was happening. Firefighters responded quickly given the early morning hour, but the intensity of the blaze prevented effective rescue efforts. After the fire was extinguished, investigators began examining the scene. Robin Rowe's survival, combined with the recent insurance changes, led to early suspicion. Investigators interviewed Rowe multiple times in the days and weeks after the fire. She always maintained that she had been asleep when the fire started, that she had woken to find the house filled with smoke, and that she had escaped but been unable to reach her family. She denied setting the fire and expressed grief and great loss at the loss of her husband and daughters. The investigation relied heavily on circumstantial evidence, insurance records showing recent increases in coverage, alleged inconsistencies in Rowe's statements about how she escaped, and fire scene interpretations suggesting arson. No direct physical evidence placed Rowe at any point of ignition. The inconsistencies in Rowe's statements were minor discrepancies about exactly how she escaped, which window she went through, whether she tried the bedroom door first, how long she was outside before calling for help. Defense attorneys would later argue these were normal variations in traumatic memories, not evidence of lying. Rowe was charged with 3 counts of first-degree homicide for the loss of life of John, Tabitha, and Stephanie Rowe. Idaho prosecutors argued that she ended the life of her family for financial gain and personal freedom. The decision to seek capital punishment was controversial, given the circumstantial nature of the evidence. Expert testimony focused on arson analysis and insurance motives. The prosecution brought in fire investigators who testified with confidence that the fire had been deliberately set. They walked the jury through burn patterns, charring depths, and fire progression, explaining why they believed the fire was arson. The defense challenged the reliability of the fire investigation. They brought in their own fire experts who disputed the state's conclusions. Defense experts testified that the burn patterns could have resulted from flashover, a phenomenon where all combustible materials in a room ignite simultaneously due to extreme heat buildup. They argued that what looked like multiple points of origin could actually be the result of fire spreading rapidly through a house built with older, more flammable materials. They emphasized the lack of physical evidence linking Rowe to arson. No accelerant purchases, no witnesses seeing her set a fire, no confession, no accelerant remains confirmed through testing. They argued that the state's case was built on inference and interpretation, rather than proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense also challenged the insurance motive, arguing that while the policies existed, they were not unusual for a family trying to be financially responsible. Many families carry life insurance without any intention of collecting on it through homicide. Despite these arguments, the jury convicted Rowe on all 3 counts of first-degree homicide. The jury deliberated for approximately 40 hours over several days before reaching their verdict. The length of discussion suggested the jurors took their task seriously and struggled with the decision. She received a capital sentence, an unprecedented outcome for a woman in Idaho. The judge imposed 3 loss-of-life sentences, 1 for each victim. In his sentencing remarks, he cited multiple serious factors: the homicide of children, the homicide of multiple victims, and the homicide committed for financial gain. The judge imposed the capital sentence, citing the homicide of multiple victims, including children, and the alleged financial motive as serious factors. The sentencing phase included victim impact statements from extended family members. John Roe's parents and siblings spoke about the loss of their son, brother, and 2 precious granddaughters. They expressed their belief that Robin was responsible and their support for the capital sentence. However, the sentencing drew criticism due to the circumstantial nature of the evidence and the evolving understanding of fire science. Some legal observers questioned whether the capital punishment was appropriate when the case rested so heavily on disputed forensic interpretations. Robin Roe's case immediately attracted attention from anti-capital punishment advocates and innocence organisations. The reliance on fire investigation evidence troubled many legal experts, particularly as questions about arson science were beginning to emerge nationally. Appeals were filed challenging both the conviction and the sentence. The appeals focused on several issues: the reliability of the fire investigation evidence, the lack of direct proof of Roe's guilt, the strength of the circumstantial case, and whether the capital punishment was appropriate given the evidentiary problems. Over the years that followed, fire science underwent the same revolution that affected other arson cases. The techniques used to convict Roe, identifying pour patterns, using charring depth to determine arson, interpreting burn patterns as proof of multiple origins, were all called into question by rigorous scientific research. Studies using controlled burns demonstrated that the indicators of arson that investigators had testified about were actually normal fire behaviour. Pour patterns could occur without any accelerant. Multiple apparent points of origin could result from flashover, rather than multiple intentionally set fires. The depth of charring was not a reliable indicator of accelerant use. The National Fire Protection Association and other fire science organisations issued new guidelines for fire investigation, essentially repudiating many of the methods used in cases from the 1980s and 1990s. The Innocence Project and similar organisations began reviewing arson convictions systematically. Robin Roe's capital sentence was ultimately overturned on appeal in 1995. The Idaho Supreme Court found errors in the trial and sentencing process serious enough to warrant overturning the loss-of-life sentences, though they upheld the homicide convictions. Her sentence was reduced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, plus an additional fixed term of years. Roe remains incarcerated at the Pocatello Women's Correctional Center in Idaho. She has been in prison for over 30 years, maintaining her innocence throughout. Her case is frequently cited in discussions about wrongful convictions, the reliability of arson evidence, and the rarity of loss-of-life sentences imposed on women. In the decades since her conviction, advances in fire science have raised serious questions about whether the fire that ended the life of her family was actually arson or was accidental. Modern fire experts who have reviewed the case files have stated that the evidence does not support an arson determination under current scientific standards. The case serves as a cautionary example of how circumstantial evidence and outdated forensic techniques can lead to the most severe punishments. Like Cameron Todd Willingham in Texas and other arson defendants, Robin Roe may have been convicted of a crime that never occurred. Her family may have passed away in a tragic accident, not a homicide. The division of opinion about Roe's guilt persists. Some people, including prosecutors and some family members, remain convinced she caused the loss of life of her family. The circumstantial evidence, the insurance policies, the financial troubles, her survival while her family perished, seems too coincidental to some observers. Others, including fire science experts and wrongful conviction advocates, believe she is innocent and that the fire was accidental. They point to the lack of any direct evidence, the absence of confirmed accelerant, and the discredited fire investigation methods as proof that Roe was convicted based on junk science. Roe continues to maintain her innocence and has sought various forms of relief through the courts. However, overturning a conviction is extraordinarily difficult, especially when the defendant has already served decades in prison. Courts are reluctant to revisit old cases, even when the science that convicted someone has been discredited. The ultimate question in Robin Roe's case may never be definitively answered. Did she homicide her family? Or did she lose them in a tragic accident and then get wrongfully convicted based on misinterpreted evidence? 3 people passed away on February 10, 1992. John Roe and his 2 daughters. Whether they passed away at Robin's hands or in an accident remains disputed more than 3 decades later. These 10 cases reveal disturbing patterns in maternal homicide and capital punishment. Financial desperation drove several acts. Riggs struggled alone. Buenoano and Barfield ended the life of for insurance. Rowe allegedly caused the loss of life of for money. Mental illness appeared repeatedly, from Riggs's depression to Montgomery's dissociation to Wuornos's trauma. Yet courts ruled it didn't eliminate responsibility. The outcomes prove strikingly inconsistent. Riggs, Buenoano, Montgomery, Wuornos and Barfield were sentence was carried out, while Routier, Moss, Scott and Rowe remain imprisoned. Scott's conviction rests on discredited fire science. Rowe's capital sentence was overturned, and Lucio may be actually innocent based on a coerced confession. For the victims, children who trusted completely, partners who never suspected, there is no restoration, while families carry trauma across generations. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the most dangerous mothers on death row, make sure to subscribe. I'll see you in the next video.